7 Tonight Show guests who came on high as a kite. The Tonight Show's classic blue curtain opens. Johnny Carson moves to his mark, delivers his monologue, and takes his seat behind the desk. 30 years of this ritual went by with a precision that rivaled a Swiss watch, a television institution, as constant as a warm bath. But this slick operation hit a maelstrom of chaos that was never, ever visible to viewers. He had a sixth sense of it as soon as they went out there, knew in a matter of seconds if a person was drunk, stoned, coked up, or worse, said a former Tonight Show producer who worked with Johnny in the 1970s. He'd get this look in his eye. That would be part amusement, part oh boy, while Johnny was always perfectly, hands down, completely composed in front of that camera. What went on in reality was a lot jarringly different. PS would be trained to look for signs. Producers would come up with contingency plans for various segments, and even network executives would linger in the wings. "We use code words," said a former Tonight Show player. If Johnny touched his tie when introducing a guest, it meant that this person was not completely sober. If he straightened his tie twice, this was a cue for the director of photography to stick with wide shots, since our guest was apt to be erratic. These minute signs were part of a complex communication system that was honed over a long period of time for a situation which would never cross mainstream viewers' minds. That of celebrities of major stature turning up for a performance on America's foremost talk show in sufficiently chemically altered states. The 1970s were wild, admitted a former Tonight Show producer. You'd find legends, Oscar winners, musical legends, literary legends turning up so blasted that they couldn't remember their own names. Johnny just seemed to make it all come out right while, say, babysitting a person with a different reality in their own heads. The most astounding was that of the beloved cultural icon, who showed up so clearly intoxicated that NBC executives were close to cutting their interview until Carson assured them that it was all part of a hilarious comedy sketch. While for the counterculture hero, his substance use was so obvious that Carson would later quip to the producers, "I think I scored a contact high, just sitting next to him. Let's order a pie for everybody." We're getting into the most severe cases of celebrities who went on Tonight Show performances while clearly in a state of being under the influence, and how Johnny Carson went above and beyond to accommodate this. But let's take a look at how celebrities were pushed to use plastics before meeting TV's most popular and most intimidating interviewer. Thank you for being here. Friday night. Yeah, okay. The waiting area, where nerves and chemicals met, was a Tonight Show waiting area, where celebrities waited for their Tonight Show performance, a place where anxiety and preparation for Tonight Show performances met in a crowded, frantic, hurried environment unlike any other television setting in history. "People don't realize how much pressure," explained a former Tonight Show talent coordinator. Carson wasn't just interviewer. A good performance would make a star out of you overnight, but a bad experience would haunt you for a decade. And unlike now, where a talk show performance involves a perfectly produced, completely lined up, and completely prepared interview, Johnny wanted conversation that wasn't prepared. That scared a lot of people. This pressure left celebrities wide open for a complete lifeline of chemicals, such as a cocktail from their popular, always stocked Tonight Show waiting area bar, pills from personal stashes, or substances that entourages were known to provide for their celebrities for a side of fame. God, that waiting area bar. I never was a heavy drinker, but it was always stocked with everything. I think it even had Dom Perignon. I was surprised, recalled a former Tonight Show employee from their 1970s and 80s lineup. Everything that was ordered, from liquor to wine, was all met with approval from Johnny himself. While it was unofficial, it was perfectly understood that a drink was fine. A second was a bit of a stretch, but attempting to enforce policy and limit their intake with major celebrities was, in a word, impossible. Other than alcohol, of course, a certain liberality with recreational drugs also meant that a lot of celebrities were used to using their drug of choice, from grass to coke to prescription pills and combinations that would become evident when it came time for their Tonight Show spot. You have to consider, though, that this was a different era, and it showed in all of late-night television, said a TV historian with a focus on late-night programming. Studio 54 was in high season. Rock stars were carrying on like Roman emperors. Even Wall Street was high on coke. The Tonight Show wasn't isolated from this. It was of this. This was a show that showed a certain side of this world that brought their own set of taboos with it. Carson himself never shied from a drink, though either he or his producers were always in control, setting up a rather conflicted dynamic when it came to interviews with guests who were not being similarly careful. John had this incredible knack for knowing how to adjust his style for a particular guest. Remember the former producer. If a guest was a bit tipsy from cocktail hour, he would gently nudge them along. If a guest came in pie-eyed, he'd break questions down in simpler terms, nudge them along, and not infrequently cut a segment short, all in a completely natural-sounding manner. This knack would be tested and retested over and over in a variety of ways over Johnny's long Tonight show run, often in response to guests pushing against what constituted boundaries of acceptability for broadcast television, starting with a certain counterculture hero who chose to enhance use of his natural gifts using chemicals offered sufficient fuel to support a certain performance, became part of a certain showbiz persona. And this started with a certain comedian with a certain reputation for stoned but clearly in control delivery, a comedian with a reputation for being a functioning stoner, but with a certain delivery that started in reluctant reaction to certain pressures from certain powers in a certain industry. And this comedian named now was named no other than George Carlin. Carlin was a Tonight Show regular over 130 times, making him one of Carson's most consistent and popular repeat guests. However, in spite of this endorsement, he never asked Carlin to be a guest host, which many comedians before him received. Johnny liked George a lot and admired his intelligence, recalled a former Tonight Show writer. He just wouldn't let him guest host. The reason, of course, was that Johnny knew his lifestyle and wasn't sure that he would take his 90-minute hosting assignment responsibly. That Carlin was different among our flyboys was his utility. Whereas many of our comedians would become incoherent and even erratic, Carlin was always bright, witty, and professional, but with a remarkably laid-back attitude that their regular audience couldn't help but notice. Carlin was a functioning herbalist, quipped a Tonight Show producer who worked with him. The weed wasn't hindering him. It was fuel for his fire. He was still George Carlin, but now it was a mellow, philosophical version of himself. So when Carlin came on, it showed how malleable Johnny was with his changing audience, though he never seemed to acknowledge Carlin's condition. He modified his interview format to suit him, asking him questions that let him ramble in all those wonderful, hilarious ways that made him a counterculture hero in the first place. He knew what he was doing every step of the way, agreed this former producer. He'd toss him a question, and then let him ramble. The result would often be access to a series of brilliant stream-of-consciousness speeches that would never have otherwise occurred if he'd been as straight as a Michael Caine film. George himself ended all doubts in his own memoir, where he wrote, "Was I usually stoned during my Carson spots in the 70s? Of course I was. In the 1970s, I was George Carlin. This isn't a tough math equation. Carlin, never stoned in his public performance, our next brilliant personality needed no enhancement, but unfortunately for him, found out how quickly everything can fall apart when even a brilliant mind turned to substance to enhance a performance went from enhancement to degradation. My friend, thank you. They all mean it. Know it that I don't know where to start. I don't. Now, to begin with, how you feeling? I felt it. Richard Pryor exposed nerve of comedy. While Carlin was functional pot use, Richard Pryor was a different story altogether. Genius comedian with issues that, in a split second, would turn Tonight Show performances from sublime to concerning. He was hilarious until he turned cosmic, said a stage manager who worked several Pryor's Tonight Show performances. Richard would begin a bit as the smartest, funniest person in the world, and then his eyes would glaze over and he would be somewhere else in his mind. Johnny would have to work like a traffic cop to bring him back. There was a complicated history with substances, Richard Pryor's, which became a particularly severe problem with his cocaine use in the late 1970s, including the freebasing accident in 1980. A couple of his Tonight Show performances showcased him in various stages of this progression. There was also a Tonight Show performance from 1978 that started out like usual, where Richard would talk about his projects. But midway through, he started a story about his youth that tapered off into a series of random observations, as if he'd wandered into a different world. The audience wasn't sure if this was part of a plan or a slip-up, but they laughed anyways. You could see Johnny turn into protection mode, went on the stage manager. He quickly asked Richard a question that brought him back on point, threw in a gag, then cut to commercial. This was a crisis averted, as opposed to a crisis. Crime. Punishment. This was a sly, precise, but completely natural-sounding bit of improv as Johnny transitioned back to commercial. It showed that Johnny cared a lot for Richard Pryor, but also worried a lot about him. Johnny wasn't like other late-night host guys I know, though. He wasn't critical of Richard's drug use, which wasn't his style, but rather worried that Richard would implode. This was from a former NBC executive who knew of their relationship. What was different about Pryor's high episodes was that you never knew what you were going to get. His genius was still there, but his eye and his filter were no longer reliable, and he would find himself walking a tightrope between comedy nirvana and network hell. Carson had a special way with Richard. Remember, former producer. When Richard was working, he'd let him run, but then he'd provide a net for him when Richard started going off the rails. Watching him work with Pryor was like watching a great animal handler, working with incredible but wild large cat. While Carson's protective mantle over performers like Pryor and Carlin was well known, he'd quickly tire those that let their disabilities bleed over from concerning to being completely unprofessional, as our next guest learns. That was a double execution that night, and it took all about an hour and a half from the time that the thing started until it was over. Truman Capote, literary genius, television disaster. While some of the chemically enhanced Tonight Show guests brought a controlled chaos with their performances, other performances left viewers holding their breath in anticipation of what would happen, as in the remarkable 1980 Tonight Show performance of a literary legend's type that left viewers in awe of how much went so completely wrong. America's literary darling, completely baked, was how a production assistant described Truman Capote's Tonight Show disaster. While a fixture on many a Tonight Show over the years, Truman Capote's January 1980 performance would be remembered not for his cutting remarks and insight, but for how completely it all went wrong from the moment he set foot on set. He was slurring so badly, you couldn't make out what he was saying. Remember a sound technician from that evening's broadcast. His head would bob forward, then jerk back up like he'd been startled. While Carson seemed to take Carlin's and Pryor's performances in stride, even making accommodations for their chemically enhanced conditions with a hearty dose of humor, Truman Capote's performance would differ, while viewers were left watching from their homes as Carson's smile congealed and his questions became increasingly simple as he tried to make sense of what was quickly becoming an impossible performance. Johnny was livid, admitted his former producer, though never on camera, of course. He was professional, but as soon as they went to commercial, he stormed backstage and said, "Never again, he's done." The part of it that particularly rankled with Carson, though, wasn't merely that Capote was handicapped, but also that it represented a lack of respect for the show and for their viewers. While Carson would tolerate a certain amount of creative chemically enhanced support from certain performers, what seemed to be a mixture of pills and whiskey had left Capote effectively useless as a guest. There's a difference between someone who's a little high and can still perform versus someone who's incapacitated, offered a former NBC executive. Capote went over that line. He wasn't just mellow and uninhibited. He was barely aware. A consequence of their experience with Capote was a greater use of backstage personnel to check a guest's condition before going on. Guests were asked to point out producers if their in-show guests seemed to be severely impacted. And even their use of bar in their green room started to be regulated. And never, of course, would this unlikely hero of Hollywood spring break make an appearance on The Tonight Show again while Carson was still host, a lifetime ban that served as a reminder of their most potent lesson for other would-be performers. While their problems with chemically enhanced performance were a result of abuse, our next subject started their Tonight Show performance with a direct honesty that typified their own personality. Now, fantasies, here are the distinguished motion picture stars, Mr. Thomas Chong and Mr. Richard Marin, better known as Cheech and Chong. Cheech and Chong, no small print there. Some of the performers that arrived for a Tonight Show performance gave no indication that their performance would be chemically enhanced. But of all of our high-flying performers, no group gave as little indication of their chemically enhanced performance as Cheech and Chong. They weren't acting. That's where their brains were. Chuckled one former segment producer for The Tonight Show for Cheech and Chong's appearances in late 1970s and early 1980s. A part of what differentiated Cheech and Chong from other performers for the Tonight Show experience, though, was host Johnny Carson's openness to use their condition as a part of their performances. Instead, rather than working around it or even covering it up, Carson would play foil to their stoner antics. Johnny would affect the straight-laced square persona around them. Remember the former writer. He'd straight-facedly ask them questions about their drug, setting up a perfect setup. This became a beautiful example of comedy where all three, including their guests, were on a bit of a bigger trick. During a particularly memorable episode of appearing on a talk show promoting their film Up in Smoke, Chong began to ramble on in a nonsensical, confused narrative of their film's production, while Carson let him continue, glancing up periodically with a raised eyebrow that left the audience in stitches. Johnny knew what he was doing. Remember, producer of that particular episode. He was effectively saying, in a roundabout way, that yes, they are as you suspected. That's, of course, a long-winded way of saying that it wasn't meant as a backhanded endorsement, but rather a way for him to point to their authenticity. There was a lot of respect between all of them. Remember the cameraman for the series. Johnny liked that they were so upfront with their drug use, and he liked that he could let them be themselves, as opposed to cleaning them up for television. This, of course, reflected a tenet of all of Carson's programming, that all of his guests needed to present themselves as naturally as possibly. While this meant that sometimes Cheech and Chong pushed boundaries that were a little bit further than most 1970s television would have allowed, their authenticity was part of that equation. Carson, as a host, always said that his job was to make his guests look good, explained a former producer. To this end, letting Cheech and Chong, as opposed to cleaning them up for television, was to make his guests look as good as possibly. They were, of course, a pair of guys that are stoned all the time, but that wasn't deficiency. While Cheech and Chong's chemical enhancement was in perfect harmony with their public image, our next guest would show how psychedelics could transform a normal talk show guest spot into an inadvertent odyssey to the edge of coherency. Who? Like, Dennis and me and Bert Schneider out there in California. Yeah. Thing about Peter Fonda, easy rider, tough interviewee. The counterculture revolution of the 1960s introduced new chemicals and new attitudes into popular consciousness, often with hilarious and spectacular results when intersecting with mainstream network television, as in Peter Fonda's legendary 1970 talk show interview. He talked about time travel. That lasted 5 minutes. Remember the Tonight Show producer. Perfectly capturing in a nutshell one of the most surreal interviews in Tonight Show history. Fonda, known for his Easy Rider film and his public advocacy of psychedelics, showed up for his scheduled Tonight Show appearance as if he were already stoned to all hell from what his handlers knew to be a dose of LSD. His eyes were as big as dinner plates. Remember the Tonight Show camera operator. He kept looking at the lights, then his hands. Then he'd jerk back into attention and try to think of Johnny's question from 30 seconds ago. Like he was either watching us from a distance or was turning on and then turning back off. Anyway, it was like watching a person tune in and out of our world. Carson, of course, immediately sensed what was afoot and went into what his staff called damage control mode, asking extremely simplistic questions, maintaining a pleasant but bland expression, and waiting for as close to a natural break in conversation as possible. The point of no return came when he asked Fonda about upcoming projects. That was a standard question, as it allowed him to promote his own work. Fonda started on a discussion of a new film project, but then went haywire, launching into a discussion of how time isn't a line, it's a circle around us like a blanket, and we're all just along for the ride, baby, on this cosmic wave of consciousness. Johnny gave the signal. Remember the Tonight Show producer. We were only 5 minutes into a 12-minute interview. They came back from their break, and Fonda was replaced as a guest with no explanation. Carson simply moved right along, uninterrupted, as a testament to his professionalism. Carson wasn't mad about it, just practical, added the director. He told the producers, let's give him another chance in a year or so. Everyone has off nights. That was Johnny. No criticism, just problem solving. Fonda would make further Tonight Show appearances later in his career, doing more traditional interviews. This, of course, became a Tonight Show story, illustrating the unpredictability of a live broadcast in a period where mainstream entertainment and counterculture were showing increasing signs of blurring. While Fonda's trip in L.A. offered a hilarious comedy of errors, our next interviewee's use of chemicals resulted in a reaction that was far from humorous, aggression that passed from lively to loud to downright unacceptable. It now very expensive in the Isle of Man. Apparently, someone has to pay back a lot of X to the government of the Isle of Man, huh? That is all of it. Oliver Reed, the British Bulldog Unleashed. Not all chemically enhanced Tonight Show episodes were as entertaining as Fonda's, as shown in British actor Oliver Reed's notorious 1975 episode, where Truman quickly precipitated from entertaining to disturbing. He made headlines and no sense. Remember the former NBC Page, a Tonight Show employee. The man was drunk, plainly, possibly other things as well, and Johnny went from laughing to alarmed in 90 seconds. Reed, of course, was already a hard case drinking, hard case living Brit in Britain. But for his Tonight Show performance, he was holding on to his bottle a bit too closely. You could see Johnny Carson's expression change when Reed started yelling. Remember the stage manager. He kept this incredible eye contact with his guests, and you knew he was thinking, well, this isn't a man who's just had a couple of cocktails. This was a very volatile person who would do anything. Things went from bad to worse when Reed started cutting in with comments that were unrelated to Carson's questions and, every now and then, shouting out answers. At one point, he stood up with no warning and started showing how a fighting position would look, much to the chagrin of the crew members. Just incredible in the studio, recalled a cameraman. Security men are moving in closer to the stage. Johnny remains calm on the surface, but you can see him tensing. He was prepared to get out of there if he needed to. Carson's strategy in dealing with Reed showed a different set of skills than when coping with high-flying guests who were merely annoying. This time, he simply took charge, cutting in on Reed's rambling monologues, firmly steering him back, and in a decisive move, cutting the interview remarkably short. If a person became nasty, hostile, or threatening, regardless of cause, then Johnny would quickly terminate the interview, explained his producer. Reed, for his part, showed how careful a line performer would tread when it came to using chemicals in order to make for a spectacular Tonight Show. What Carson told the bookings people afterwards was, "If a star can't control himself, then he won't sit in my chair," related a former talent coordinator. About as many as I know are 5 performers who were permanently blacklisted from The Tonight Show, and those 5 were joined by no less a person than Oliver Reed. Another cautionary tale of olfactory excess showed a fine line between ADD enhancement that allowed for extraordinary programming and ADD that threatened to disrupt that desired perfectly civilized conversation that Tonight Show aimed for, a line that our third player in this drama allegedly danced around in pratfall proportions in performance that became. All the rage in a period that remembered practically everything. Well, you must have told him where we were because somebody came and got it. A grunt from Sammy Davis Jr., because I used that as my fuel. None inspired as much conjecture as a hyperkinetic 1974 interview of Sammy Davis Jr. that left viewers wondering what was fueling this legendary performer. Cool on stage, chaos backstage. Some production assistant for that evening, encapsulating the contrast between Davis's choreographed performance and the frantic energy swirling around his presence. A Tonight Show fixture and one of Johnny Carson's all-time favorites, Sammy Davis Jr. was a complete performer in every sense, with his musical, comedic, and life experiences providing a treasure trove of television riches. His 1974 Tonight Show performance was, however, particularly frenzied. He was talking a mile a minute, couldn't stay in his seat, kept stopping himself to formulate new sentences. Remember the sound technician who helped with that evening's show. His eyes were racing from side to side. He was perspiring under the lights as much as usual, but seemed to be racing along. While many fans were merely watching a passionate Sammy being his usual, effervescent self, those in the industry knew that this was no different than other signs of cocaine use that were quickly spreading like wildfire in the entertainment industry around this time in the 1970s. Everyone backstage knew. Remember production assistant. This wasn't just a reaction from Johnny. This was chemically induced. That bathroom in the green room had been occupied for a considerable amount of time before his actual performance, if you know what I mean. While Carson, as always, was nimble in working around this charged energy with a professional ease that showcased that of his guest's rapid-fire storytelling, even while laying down a guidepost for him periodically, he did make a small humorous quip when commercial break rolled around. Wiping his brow, he quipped, "I think I just caught a whiff of secondhand exhaustion from that interview." The key with this interview with Davis, as opposed to possibly other performers, was that despite what was no doubt a chemically enhanced performance, his professionalism never wavered. While other performers were rambling incoherently, napping, and or otherwise proving to be a nightmarish accompaniment, for listeners, all that was present was a spectacular performance, turned merely a little louder. Sammy was a pro's pro, remembered a former talent coordinator. Even if there was any truth to what was fueling that performance, he never blurred the line between professional and unprofessional. He gave precisely what the audience craved, only with a little more voltage. Davis himself never denied or confirmed rumor when it cropped up every now and then in the years that followed. Asked once about that performance, he allegedly grinned and said, "Baby, that was a 7S, the 7S, and let's just let it rest." This performance of Davis's was from a different order of chemically facilitated Tonight Show performances. Not disaster performances, per se, but ones that were not necessarily meant as laughs, but were merely performances in which substances were used which had a potential to heighten an individual's natural talents, but were as mainstream as Tonight Show TV would allow. We fall head over heels in love with someone you just met. Or, as my sweet college professor reminded us, remember the letters VLENTINE, Valentine's Day. Carson's tightrope of entertainment versus values. What Johnny was doing in those 7 performances with Carlin, Pryor, Truman Capote, Cheech and Chong, Fonda, Reed, and Sammy Davis Jr. has a lot to do with the definition of late-night programming in America, said a television historian who concentrates on late 1970s programming. He was dealing with a revolution in values, especially in terms of recreational substances. Things that were naughty in 1962 when he started his Tonight Show were no longer naughty in 1975, supporting his revolution, but also maintaining a certain standard for that programming. His aim was a middle-of-the-road policy that would be entertaining yet also professional. Carson's take on Tonight Show performers who were chemically enhanced was no different. His representation of chemically enhanced performers showed a deep set value that TV programming was, above all, fun, professional, and entertaining. Carson classified this performance as using an impairment spectrum that depended upon how that performance impacted that particular guest delivery of good programming. If you were normal in every way, but you couldn't make good programming, Johnny wouldn't book you, remembered a former producer. So long as you were good on air, you were with Johnny. Getting stoned but being brilliant wasn't a problem. Truman Capote, getting incoherent and out of it, that was a problem. This down-to-earth attitude embodied a larger worldview that Carson had with television, that it was a platform for entertainment, not moralizing. While other hosts of this period might use guests with impairments as means to moralize, cheap laugh, or otherwise condescend, all of which would be in all caps in any list of worst hosts ever, Carson did his best to highlight these guests in the best possible ways, as was feasible. He was a protector of his guests, even those that brought their own issues, remembered his long-term talent coordinator. If people were messed up from being high and drunk, Johnny would double down to make sure that a guest would get a soft landing. He'd help people get out of tough spots through jokes, simplifying questions for him, and steering a conversation to a safer area. There would be a point, though, where a guest brought a lack of functionality that Johnny found unacceptable, fouling, aggression, pointlessness. Then, as shown with both Oliver Reed and Truman Capote, his patience ran out. Johnny had 3 rules that weren't breakable, no matter how rich you were. Don't threaten anyone, no matter who it was. Don't be rude about your audience. And never waste air. This would, naturally, result in a no matter how nice you are, you're not getting invited back. What's particularly interesting about this period of Carson as opposed to our contemporary period, pointed out a television historian, is how these chemically enhanced performances were received in their immediate experience in relation to how our present-day societal structure would see these performances. If this were a contemporary event, I think it would make for many, many late-night jokes on a major talk show with concomitant Twitter meltdown, as well as possibly afterward an apologia tour.